This technically is a 65 because it is a 140. It's the 4 one-barrel carburetor engine. Bigger intake valves, bigger exhaust valves, bigger exhaust. You're moving more air is essentially what, you know, if Bill was putting a drivetrain in the car, even into late 64, he may have procured one of these engines. The 140 was all the rage. You look at some of the stuff that Steve McQueen was doing with Corvairs and buggies, and they were mostly all 140. A lot of hot rodders use this front end because it's a unitized front end. It can easily be adapted to anything. And then also, in addition to that, the Corvair steering box, very unitized, small box. Again, another big item for hot rod use. I'm sure that's what Bill was considering when he decided to go with this. Not only the drivetrain, the Unipack, but also the front end. Very adaptable. This is essentially what you've got up front. This is it stripped down to its original state, so to speak, from the factory. This is the Power Guide automatic transmission, and we should probably do an internally regulated alternator to keep things simple. The Silhouette 2 made by Bill Cushenberry. I'm just going to speak a little bit about his choice on the Corvair front end, rear end, suspension, and drivetrain. I had never spoke with Bill, but I've seen similar things where they'll transplant a Corvair drivetrain and or front axle suspension, usually because of the first reason, because it is a very transplantable powertrain. The way General Motors designed this from wheel to wheel, the K-member and the drivetrain itself was known as the Unipack. And the Unipack can be simply unbolted from any chassis and placed into any other chassis. I'm sure Cushenberry recognized that back in the 60s and said we need to build a chassis for the Silhouette 2. We need to have a drivetrain that has some torque and some power, more than a Volkswagen would offer, and is very transplantable. And I'm sure that's why he picked the Corvair base to do that. So what we're working with here is a 1965 140 horsepower. It should have 4 carburetors. It's a 164 cubic inch engine fitted with a 355 axle and a Power Glide 2-speed transmission. The Power Glide 2-speed transmission is very similar to the full-size Power Glide. However, it is a Corvair designated Power Glide. So that is basically your powertrain. Then you have your straight axles, so this makes this a 1960 to 64. Actually, this one here is about a 62, 61 suspension with swing axle. Has 4 lugs, and then we have the K-member out in front here. As we move to the front here, we also have a Corvair front end. Again, a very transplantable 4 bolts, 6 bolts. The front end's in anything you want to build it around. You can see a couple bolts here and a couple bolts here. Basically, that's what's holding this whole Corvair front suspension into the subframe that Cushenberry built. So again, for the same reason as the back, it's a very transplantable suspension, drum to drum, or wheel to wheel in this case, that you don't really have to alter too much. So again, I think the base model on this car, when Bill started, was a 61. So I'm sure when they started with this 61, they pulled those suspensions out, pulled the drivetrain out, the Unipack out, and then created and modified the frame to suit the Silhouette 2, and then they could easily place it right back on top and you're in business. So that's why I think they picked the Corvair drivetrain. I think the Corvair drivetrain, obviously from my standpoint, is an excellent choice. It's lightweight, puts out a good amount of horsepower, a good amount of torque, and it's not a complicated, has no radiator, water system, or anything like that to complicate things. So it's a very simple, very effective, and very transplantable platform. Cylinder heads. These are your cylinder heads, Barry, for the Silhouette 2. These are 140 heads. They have 2 intakes for the carburetors, but most importantly, they have larger valves than a standard Corvair head. And then what we've done is put deep seats in here, new stainless steel forged swirl polished valves, bronze valve guides. We've surfaced the heads, milled the valve cover rails, heavy duty springs, a 5-angle valve grind, and we repair all the thread holes, including sheet metal and spark plug holes, valve cover holes, and such. So this is a fully remanufactured head. It is not a simply cleaned and ground valve job. It is a completely rebuilt head. The next thing is the engine case. Again, I wasn't going to use your engine case. We're starting with a new one. About 4 hours worth of prep work here, Barry, including glass beating. Obviously, we mic everything first and check its integrity before we spend any time cleaning it. But then we glass beat it. We chase all the threads. It's a known commodity by the time we start assembly. We have a proprietary counterbore that we do here on the case bolts. There's large case bolts that bolt the case together, and they have a propensity to leak through there. So we've developed a proprietary system for putting O-rings in there. So it's a little just extra added quality. This is your crankshaft here. I'm going with a standard crankshaft. It's a forged crankshaft. It's not been machined. It's been micro-polished. It's within spec at standard. This is also the new cam here, and then our own billet cam gear, which is much better than the stock cam gear. And that's made up in Burbank, actually. Then here we're running reboard cylinders. These are 30 thousandths over with rebuilt rods, new pistons and rings, obviously. So at this point, we're about ready to start through the final assembly on the engine. Once we do that, we'll focus on carburation and get this thing buttoned up with your transaxle. Okay, this is our chassis here. It's fundamentally set up on a Corvair, what we call the K member. The early model Corvair K member, as you can see, is if you will, your keel, so to speak, and everything is built around that. Same with the front suspension. One of the things about the Corvair that was unique for production of American automobiles, it was a unit body car. So the Corvairs were built by Fisher Body. The rear suspensions, the Unipack, and the front suspension were then added at Chevrolet. So it lends itself to this type of modification very well. It's a compartmentalized type of setup. So as you can see here, you've got the Corvair front end. Essentially we're talking about 4 bolts, and the whole front suspension drops out. So whether you're using it for a dune buggy or for a custom car like the Silhouette 2, it's a very adaptable suspension and rear suspension and drivetrain. So obviously somebody spent some spent some good time doing a very nice job building this chassis. They finished the welds. It's registered, and it's ready for the drivetrain to be installed.